This ugly step has just been rotting away at my front door ever since the day I moved in, so I finally ripped it out and built this cedar wrap step in its place. I'm going to show you step for step how I built this, so without further ado, let's get started. So obviously the first thing I had to do was rip out that old step, and I'm wearing gloves because look how disgusting. This thing was like a spider hotel. I'm actually still queasy looking at it. I'm not gonna lie, this thing was heavy, so it was a bit of struggle moving it, but once I was able to shimmy it out of the way, I just cleaned up the area by giving it a good vacuum, and then I was ready to start building the new step. I started by measuring out how wide and how deep I wanted this step to be. I knew I didn't want it to be as big as the old one. Basically just wanted it to extend a couple inches past each side of the door frame and then be deep enough to fit a doormat on. And then once I was happy with the size, I cut down my lumber. Now I'm using pressure treated wood for the base because it's rot resistant and relatively cheap, and then I'll be wrapping it in cedar after. Now I'm building this on a concrete slab that's pretty wonky, so I had some leveling to do before I could move on. Here I'm just adjusting the board until it's level and then measuring the gap between the concrete and the wood. Then I transferred this measurement to the opposite end of the board and made a diagonal cut using a table saw, but you could also do this with a circular saw. Here's the cut board now, and as you can see, it's sitting nice and level with the concrete. I repeated this exact same process off camera to level out the other side as well as the front and the back of the base. And then I also made some cuts along the tops of the boards so that the whole thing was the same height. And then once that's good to go, you can secure your base together. To do that, I'm just screwing 3-inch deck screws into the corners. Okay, now since I'm going to be installing the top of my cedar step in this pattern, I needed to install some blocking so that I have something to screw those outer perimeter pieces into. But please be forewarned that I actually messed this up and I didn't realize and correct it until later in this video. So initially I just screwed these 2 4-inch wide pieces on each side, but when it came to the point of actually installing the cedar on top, I quickly realized that those gaps in the wood underneath made it so that I couldn't put screws where I needed to put them. So here's how it looks after I eventually fixed it, and you'll want to just do it this way right off the bat. And since there won't be any airflow coming through the top, you'll want to drill a hole in the adjacent joist just so that moisture doesn't get trapped in this section. I then repeated that process of leveling out each joist to match the slope of the concrete pad by cutting the bottom of them all at an angle prior to installing. And then to space out my last 2 joists, I just measured the remaining distance and divided that up evenly. The general rule of thumb is to install joists 12 to 16 inches on center so that your deck boards don't sag over time. So just keep that in mind. Now we're going to flip this thing over for a sec so we can work on the base. So the first thing we'll do is seal any exposed areas that were cut, as well as the end grain with a exterior wood sealer. And I'm just using an acrylic stain, which I'll have linked for you. I wanted the base to be slightly elevated off the concrete because otherwise the moisture in the concrete will transfer to the wood and then accelerate the rate at which it starts to rot. So I had some scrap shingles and I cut those up into squares and screwed them in at various points. And this will give me about a 1/4-inch gap between the concrete and the wood. I didn't show it here, but just so you know, I did also screw a couple of shingles into the back of the step so that there'd be a small gap between the back of the step and the siding. Okay, let's slide the step back into place and make sure it's positioned right where you want it now, because we're going to be securing it permanently by screwing it into the house. I'm just screwing into wood here, so I'm still using deck screws, but if you're attaching to concrete, make sure you use concrete specific fasteners. I also went back in and applied 2 coats of that same sealer we used underneath to the top of the step. And then once that was dry, I covered all the joists with joist tape as an extra layer of protection from the elements. Okay, now let's see if we can't get this thing looking a little prettier. So here I'm using 1x4 cedar, and to start I'm leveling out the board and setting it in place with a screw just temporarily. And then here I'm setting a scribe to match the widest point and then scribing a line all the way along the bottom. I then took the board and cut right along this line with a jigsaw, and so now when I go to reinstall it, it matches the concrete perfectly. And we are going to be removing all these boards again when we go to finish them. So that's why I'm just using one screw at each end, just enough to hold it in place for now while we fit the remaining pieces. These top bits were a lot easier to install. They were already the right height, so all I had to do was just cut it down to the length that I needed and we're good to go. Like I say, I'm taking all the boards off again so that I can finish them. And I did make a mark on the back of each one where it's supposed to go so that I can fit it all back together like a jigsaw puzzle. To finish, I'm sanding the front side of each board down with 180 grit sandpaper, and then once it's nice and smooth, give everything a good wipe down with a tack cloth or a damp microfiber just to remove all the dust. Now we're going to do 2 coats of that same clear coat we used on the pressure treated wood. And just a little tip for you, I would recommend applying this to the back side first and then giving that about 10 to 15 minutes to dry before flipping it over and doing the front and the sides. That way you're left with a nice clean front face and any product runoff from the sides will end up on the back. Once that's all completely dry, we can screw everything back into place. Let's move on to the top of the step. Okay, we're going to work on those perimeter pieces first, and I like to just lay a piece down and make a mark right at the corner so I know where to make my cut. Same process here as we used for the side of the step. I'm basically just cutting my pieces out, making sure that they all fit the way that I want them to, and then securing them in place with 1 or 2 screws because, again, we're going to be removing these to finish them. For these final inside pieces, I'm just checking what length to cut them by measuring both at the front and the back of the step. Of course, these 2 measurements should be the same, but it never hurts to double check. Once you have your pieces cut, just drop one in and confirm that it does actually, in fact, fit before removing all the top pieces again so we can finish them. And then from here, it's just a rinse and repeat. So sand down the front pieces till they're nice and smooth, hand sand the edges, remove all the dust with a cloth, and then apply 2 coats of your clear coat. Look how beautiful this cedar looks after a good sand and some clear coat. All right, home stretch here, people. Let's go ahead and reinstall all those top pieces, and you're going to want to be specific about where you put your screws because they're going to be visible, of course, so make sure they add to the design rather than detract from it. I'm using a set square to mark out where each screw will go, and this way they'll all be lined up and spaced evenly. Just to take you on a little walk down memory lane, here is where we started, and here's the new front step. I'm super happy with how this turned out, and I think it's a big step up from that eyesore out front before. So this is your sign. If you have a rotting step or porch that you've been meaning to deal with, I hope this video helps you do just that.